was going to do is I was going to say what I said then and what I'll say now and what I'll be able to substantiate, what I'll be able to demonstrate from the text, that what Ignatius is doing is he is providing an anti-docetic argument, a polemic against Docetism. The Docetics believed that Jesus did not have a physical body. So they were Gnostics, and John warned about them in 1 John, and Ignatius warns about them in his letters as well. So normally, I would have simply given that as a quick response and directed people to the fuller conversation in my videos online. But a couple of months ago, I was having a conversation with a brother online who's been doing a lot of study into Ignatius, and especially the Ignatian corpus. Now, what in the world is that? Well, what a lot of people don't understand about documents in church history is that when you deal with Roman Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church has utilized forgeries for many, many centuries. In fact, it's interesting. Joe Heschmeyer is an attorney. I debated another attorney on the perpetual, I think it was the perpetual virginity of Mary. Yeah, it was perpetual virginity of Mary on Long Island a number of years ago. And during the debate, he gave this quote from Augustine. And I had never heard of it before. But back then, you couldn't, even now during debate, it would be hard to check something like that. Though it could be done much more quickly than it could back then. Maybe during a break or something you could. And after the debate, in the weeks afterwards, we dig this quote out. It's a forgery. Augustine didn't say it. And I'm not saying that my opponent knew that, but the fact of the matter is Rome has a long history. All I got to say is donation of Constantine. All I've got to say is pseudo-Isidorian decretals. And these are forged works that had tremendous impact on the defense and of the papal claims, the building up of the papacy, things like that. And so there were a lot of forged works. For example, Melito Sardis, really important witness in the late second century, deity of Christ, canon issues. But guess what? There's also epistles by what we call pseudo-Melito. And so it was very common, sadly, for a long time, if you wanted your book to get read, and nobody knew who in the world you were, you would put someone's name on it that was much better known than you are. And really, honestly, until around the time of the Renaissance, Europe suffered from anachronism. And I've told this story many times before. You see paintings from the 11th to 12th century of David in the Bible, and he has armor on, and he's riding a horse and lives in a castle. Because that's where kings live, and that's how they fight, and they have armor, and they ride horses, and stuff like that. And people assume things had always been the way they were then. And that makes it very hard to detect forgeries. How do you detect a forgery? Well, I'll give you an example. The Gospel of Barnabas that the Muslims love to promote actually comes from about the 13th century. Has nothing to do with biblical Barnabas, but it's so laughably bad because it mentions all sorts of stuff that didn't exist in the first century and really only came to exist, 1,000 years later. And so today it's a lot easier to recognize these things because we understand anachronism. We understand that, well, you see it all the time. You know that meme you see on Twitter or Facebook or whatever you use, where it's got Abraham Lincoln, and it's as Abraham Lincoln said, "Don't believe everything you see on the internet." And it's supposed to be funny because obviously Abraham Lincoln had no earthly idea what the internet would be, or it certainly didn't exist during his day. So there's an example of anachronism. But the problem is Rome has a long history of utilizing forgeries that we can recognize by the presence of anachronism to substantiate their claims. And so there is an entire, when we talk about the Ignatian corpus, in its broadest application, that is all the works that are attributed to Ignatius, who's the Bishop of Antioch, who was martyred between 107 and 108, 109. All of those dates, we don't have records someplace that say that. There's a reasoning process that goes into coming up with these numbers, and that's what I was taught in seminary. And I had a real interest in those things, so I got the best editions you could get at the time in the 1980s. Bishop Lightfoot's introduction and his translation and the Greek text, and that's what I've always used, and most people back in those days, that's what everybody used. And by that point in time, it had become recognized that a lot of what was attributed to Ignatius had nothing to do with Ignatius. It was written long afterwards. When? It's hard to say. When you look at the Ignatian corpus, generally what you hear people talking about is the middle recension, which is generally called the genuine epistles. There are 7. And the generally accepted idea, and this is what I've always taught as well, it's what I was taught, what I've taught others, that these were written as Ignatius was going from Antioch to Rome to be martyred. Now, why they would do that is an interesting question that people have brought up since then. Why would you spend the money to send somebody from Antioch all the way to Rome to execute them? Because it would be highly unusual for the people in Rome who are going to see this execution know even who this guy was. Some of the Christians might, but anyway. Allegedly, as he's going to Rome, he writes these 7 letters. And then the longer recension is, especially in the Latin, is generally in the Latin, and has, if you compared that with the middle recension, considered to be genuine in Greek, it's hard to even figure out how they're related. I mean, there's just so much added stuff and redaction and editing and stuff like that. And then you've got a shorter recension in Syriac that's basically based on the middle recension, but edited down. When, by whom, nobody knows. Nobody knows. So this is the Ignatian corpus, and some of the pseudo-Ignatian stuff is pretty wild, pretty crazy. Believe it or not, there's a letter that allegedly Ignatius wrote to the Virgin Mary while she was still alive, asking questions of her. And you can find Roman Catholics even to this day promoting that kind of thing as part of tradition. There's a tradition that says this, there's a tradition that says that. Well, it's a tradition that has no connection to history, but there you go. So the works that are attributed to Ignatius, no one else that I know of. Polycarp, no. You don't have that kind of complexity with books like the Didache or the Apostolic Constitutions or Irenaeus, any of the second century writers, Justin. You just, now, will you have later forgeries attached to pretty much all their names? I haven't run into a pseudo Irenaeus stuff, but yeah, that was the whole point. Was you had people will use those better known names to get their books going, and so there might be, but to have entire recensions to where you have to identify them as the longer and the shorter and the middle, and they're in different languages and all the rest of this kind of stuff. Ignatius's epistles are a mess. And I'm not even talking now about variations in what's considered to be the genuine Ignatian epistles, such as textual variation. Because the earliest manuscripts that we have of the what are called the genuine epistles, and remember, that's a modern term. Nobody 500 years ago was talking about the genuine, 600 years, the genuine Ignatian epistles. That's post-Renaissance, after people started going, oh, hey, we need to look for anachronism and stuff like that. So that's more of a modern description. And, the earliest manuscripts we have for the genuine epistles are from the 11th century. So that's 1,000 years after the earliest dating that we would give to Ignatius's epistles. Again, normally the earliest you'll find will be in the first decade of the 2nd century. So 107, 108, somewhere around there. So I get asked this question, and I have been having conversations over the past number of weeks and months with a brother who may get to join me next week to talk about this stuff once we're back to the big studio and we can put stuff up on the screen. I'm in a hotel room. I can't even show you text. I can't put the Bible text up. I can't put Ignatius up. I can't put anything up right now. We're going to fix that eventually. It will be available even if I have to do an emergency driving trip like I just did. But I can't right now. So I'm somewhat limited. I don't have normally I'd have Lightfoot in my hand right here, or something like that. Well, he is on there somewhere because I have that in accordance and stuff. But I can't show that to you. So I'm somewhat limited as to how in-depth I can go right now. But this gentleman and I have been, his brother and I have been chatting, and he's been throwing this stuff at me, going, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And he's throwing articles that I've not seen before. They've come out, and I forgot to, forgive me, let me pull this up here. Open recent. Of course you're not going to make this easy for me. A lot of this stuff has been put together. Here it is. Since I was in seminary and since I last taught in this area. And pretty much from starting in 1990 and really in the past 20 years, there have been all sorts of articles that have been pointing to serious problems with the standard story that has been told about Ignatius. And they come to different conclusions. Some can go to radical conclusions, questioning whether Ignatius existed. But most of them are just focused on, well, the dating doesn't seem right here. They're raising questions of anachronism. And anachronism is the whole issue that we've looked at before, talking about that. And by the way, it was Lorenzo Valla who first sort of recognized that there was the problem of anachronism by comparing the current manuscripts of the Latin Vulgate with Jerome's commentaries on the scriptures. And he demonstrated that the texts in the Vulgate had been changed over time in comparison to what Jerome's going to put his own translation in his own commentaries. So, but Jerome's commentaries aren't going to be copied as often as the text of the Latin Vulgate. And so I just point out that when Valla did his work, he didn't publish it because to publish that kind of stuff would have resulted in his being burned. So there were other issues going on at this particular point in time. And of course, that would have been burned by Rome. So anyways, this brother, well, I guess if I'm going to possibly have him on next week, I'm talking about Timothy Easley, and some of you on Twitter may have been following some of the stuff he's commented on this. I got the feeling he said recently he was going to sort of drop the Ignatius stuff for a while. Well, sorry. It's all your fault anyways. So Timothy sent me one article that I looked at. This was in Currents in Biblical Research, 2020, volume 19. And I will undoubtedly slaughter this name because I've never heard of the gentleman before. Doesn't mean anything. He's in the Liberal Arts Department, Presbyterian University and Theological Seminary in the Republic of Korea. Jonathan Lukadu, or Lukadu. I would say Lukadu, probably. A lot of vowels there. But anyways, let me read you the abstract and then a little bit of the introduction of this. The title is The Date and Authenticity of the Ignatian Letters, an Outline of Recent Discussions. That's really useful to give an outline of recent discussions. This article examines recent studies of the date and authenticity of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. Although the debate has a long history, this article focuses on the most recent period of this debate, from roughly 1997 through 2018. While not wanting to diminish the differences between contributors to this debate, three general views can be adduced. This article begins by highlighting the major players and formative contributors to each view. Of particular note in this most recent phase of debate is the separation of the date of the letters from the question of their authenticity. The article next turns to consider the primary pieces of evidence that are utilized when considering Ignatius's date, the historical value of the Eusebian evidence, the possibility of interpolations within Polycarp's Philippians, another one of the early references to Ignatius, and Ignatius's interactions with second sophistic rhetoric. The conclusion inquires about whether there is other evidence that might be utilized to aid scholars in dating and evaluating the Ignatian letters more securely. And then in the introduction, although the authenticity of the Ignatian letters has been disputed since at least the 17th century. I'm going to skip over all the names and dates since you're probably not going to be writing them down anyways. Since the 17th century, the debate has received renewed energy since the late 1990s and shows few signs of slowing. While Ignatian scholars have continued to study the various textual recensions in which Ignatius's letters are found, the ongoing discussion about date and authorship interrupts the consensus that Ignatius's letters are authentically Ignatian and date to the early 2nd century. This consensus was worked out in large part by Theodore Zahn and J.B. Lightfoot. Lightfoot is the material that I generally used in school and when teaching. Although Ignatian authenticity was challenged during the 20th century by Trammell, Weichenberg, and I'm going to skip the names, elicited the most immediate responses, the consensus held through most of the 20th century. However, it remains difficult to explain every peculiarity within the Ignatian letters if they are dated early in the 2nd century. Reinhard Hübner's work on 2nd century theology thus inspired hope in at least one Ignatian scholar during the 1990s that our understanding of the letters' date and authenticity would be sharpened. Citing Hübner, Christine Trevitt wrote that Reinhard Hübner may shed light on this issue in the near future. While Hübner's arguments have hardly settled the issue of when Ignatius's letters should be dated, his studies have had a powerful effect on all Ignatian scholarship that has followed and have opened the possible dates for Ignatius's letter to include any of the years between roughly 105 and 180. Okay, that's a major shift. Okay, this article examines recent scholarship on the question of the date and authenticity of the middle recension, also called the genuine letters, of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. It begins by looking at the work of Hubner, and it goes on. So again, it's titled "The Date and Authenticity of the Ignatian Letters: An Outline of Recent Discussions." But so why read all that? Well, there is a video that Timothy sent me, and my recollection is this was a Roman Catholic fellow who's just about to finish his PhD in Ignatius, and he had all sorts of graphs and charts in this YouTube video laying out the real sticky questions about how we know what we claim to have known for a long time about the dating, origin, source, relationship, recensions, editing, all sorts of stuff like that. And some of it, you know, I was planning on having a conversation with him eventually when I had a little more time to delve into it. You know, some of it is dealing with stuff like, I think Ignatius is dealing with this subject here, and that didn't come about until like 160. Well, if you're familiar with like Bart Ehrman's stuff, where he denies the 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Ephesians, Colossians were written by Paul, he does that based on his formulation of what he thought the early church looked like. And since 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus present a advanced state of the organization of the church that he didn't think existed back then, and that's why he rejects them as being Pauline. Well, I think that's getting the cart before the horse, and so I'm really not sure of that kind of argumentation, to be honest with you. But it's part of a lot of conversation. I skipped over the names, but there's just all sorts of articles that are cited just in that one article about how this is being struggled with at this time, and that there is this scholarly discussion going on concerning when Ignatius lived, what he wrote, do we really know what he wrote, what about the recensions, what about the editing, all this kind of stuff. This subject is going on. So back to the debate. Joe Heschmeyer asks me about the text in Smyrnians. And a few years ago, I would have just simply said he was arguing against Docetus. It's very plain from the language. We can go here, 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 and moved on. But since I was looking at these articles, watched the video, see all these charts with all the differences and questions about this, that, and the other thing, and since I have never raised these issues, I've never put a little asterisk next to a citation of Ignatius. And I've cited Ignatius. I've cited Ignatius to Muslims, Unitarians, Roman Catholics, because when he writes to the Romans, even though he addresses the bishops of other churches, he doesn't address a bishop in Rome because Rome hadn't developed a monarchical episcopate yet. So that's actually evidence of very early period here, though some people might use that, argue differently. But I had never acknowledged this new information because it was new to me. And if you think that that's somehow strange, I remember when I started doing a PhD work down at Potchefstroom a number of years ago, my Dr. Vader did his PhD under Metzger. He knows textual criticism very, very well. But he and I both learned about CBGM together. And we were teaching these things. We were active in these things. But but there's so much specialization that unless you start a new project that's going to push you out of your area, out of where you've taught before, it's very easy for a lot of these conversations to not end up in your attention. So I started to, all I wanted to do was to briefly acknowledge the controversy concerning the Ignatian corpus. And while this new stuff I wasn't aware of, I wrote an article, and it's available online, in 1990, so 35 years ago, refuting the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society's abuse of Ignatius. They had, in 1989, they did a series of articles in the Watchtower, and they just massacred Ignatius. Well, they massacred everybody. It was very, you could tell it was very purposeful. They knew what they were doing. And when they presented Ignatius's views, they only quoted from pseudo-Ignatian epistles. They did not quote from the genuine epistles, because the genuine epistles have numerous references to the deity of Christ, especially in the letter to the Ephesians. And so I had to deal with the pseudo-Ignatian stuff and things like that. I may have mentioned the difference between the Greek and the Latin and some of the recension stuff. I don't remember if I actually dove into that very much, but it's not that I wasn't aware of that element. That's been going on, as that article said that I was just reading to you from, for centuries. Not that I have been doing that for centuries. My grandkids think I have, but anyway. And so I had dealt with that at that particular point in time. And 17 years ago, when I did the Who Reads Ignatius in Context videos, I don't believe I got into that at all, because I was just dealing with Steve Ray's use of that particular quotation. So it would have just dragged us off into stuff we didn't need to do. So what I wanted to do was simply say there's a lot of questions about the Ignatian corpus and the various recensions today. But if we take the text as we have it, this is an anti-docetic polemic, and it's not presenting what you think it's presenting or what Roman Catholics think. So it wouldn't have taken me very long